The situation in Texas and Louisiana is getting worse by the hour as the storm known as Harvey hammers the region. Rainfall has reached record levels, floodwaters are breaching levees, and at least 15 people have died. Thousands have been rescued, but thousands more are still trapped by the rising floodwaters, which experts now say could take weeks to recede. President Trump arrived today to survey some of the damage, though he didn't travel to Houston, saying he didn't want to distract from ongoing rescue efforts there.
This was of epic proportion. Nobody's ever seen anything like this.
Here at home, people in and around Boston are sending money, dropping off donations, and looking for other ways to help.
We're so lucky.
Well, yeah, everybody's hurting over there. It could be us next time.
Indeed, it could. Last year, FEMA updated its flood maps for Boston to show much more of the city is in danger of flooding, thanks to changes in sea levels and other data. And it may not take a storm anywhere near as bad as Harvey to get us there. So are we prepared? And if not, what still needs to be done? Joining me are Austin Blackman, the City of Boston's Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, and Deanna Moran, Director of Environmental Planning at the Conservation Law Foundation. Thank you both for coming in.
Thanks.
So what would the impact on Boston be if we had a Harvey-type storm or Hurricane Sandy-type storm hit the city squarely at high tide?
The impacts would certainly be substantial, but what Boston's really concerned about is not only what we need to do to get the city back to normal right now, but also what we need to do to make sure that we're prepared as climate change impacts our city more and more. So we've done an analysis called Climate Ready Boston that looks out to 2100s to combine what the impacts of sea level rise as well as severe weather would look like.
Okay, I want to get to the prep that you're doing, but Deanna, can you talk us through how much of the city would be underwater if we did have a big storm like this hit at high tide? I remember that it's not just the seaport. There's all sorts of the city that would be affected, right?
Absolutely. So you mentioned the update to the FEMA flood maps. Unfortunately, the way FEMA flood maps are done, they rely on historical information. And so, you know, as Austin was saying, we have projection information for what the future floodplain will look like, and in some cases what it already looks like. And it involves, you know, a much more expansive area of Boston than is currently regulated under FEMA. And so you have a lot of homeowners who are in the floodplain and don't know they're in the floodplain that would be affected.
So who might fit that bill? People in the Back Bay, I recall, could be flooded if there was a Sandy-type storm, 7.5-foot storm surge.
The two most susceptible areas to flooding will be East Boston and South Boston, including the Seaport area. And, you know, part of that is because Boston has built itself on a lot of tidelands. You know, back when Boston was founded in 1630, we had 50% less land mass than we do today, and a lot of that was built at sea level.
I just want to see if you guys are on the same page about this. How likely is the scenario that I'm floating here, that there's going to be a big storm that's going to hit and cause mass flooding? What would you put the likelihood at?
Well, if you look at a situation like they're experiencing in Houston right now, Harvey could ultimately be the largest amount of rainfall of any storm in the U.S. So in terms of its likelihood, it's very, very unlikely for something like that at that level to happen. The likelihood of us having a storm that's going to have substantial impact on Boston is very high because Boston is a very vulnerable city. Particularly on the U.S., some agencies have rated Boston in the top 5 in terms of vulnerability to impacts from severe weather and sea level rise.
And what does that mean exactly? Looking ahead, say 25 years, what would the percentage chance be?
So, I mean, in terms of Massachusetts is absolutely susceptible to a major flood event like is happening in Texas. The characteristics of the type of storm that would happen here would obviously be different, but Massachusetts is also more susceptible to flooding because of the type of terrain we have. It's sharper and steeper versus Texas where there's rolling hills. And we have the added disadvantage in Boston that our stormwater infrastructure is very old and wouldn't be able to handle the amount of extreme precipitation that they're experiencing.
I asked the mayor yesterday about Boston's readiness for a Harvey-type storm, or even something not quite this bad. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We just had a brief conversation today, but it will be a conversation we'll have this week about are we prepared for it? Do we have enough supplies? Where's a safe area in the city to go? Where's a high enough area in the city to go? How do we evacuate people? So we're gonna start take a real good look at this in the city and prepare for it.
So, Austin, other than having that conversation that the mayor, your boss, described there, what has the city been doing to get ready for an event like this? And what maybe still remains to be done?
Sure. Well, it's a couple things that we've done already. First and foremost, when you look at our planning for what if this happens tomorrow, we've been continuously updating our evacuation plans. That's work that's led by our Office of Emergency Management. They coordinate not only with the national authorities, but also with the state authorities, and then internally with some of our first responders, so including the police department, fire department, EMS, et cetera, et cetera. So making sure that we understand what our transportation and evacuation routes are, how we need to have those staffed, how we make sure that we get people out of danger, and then how we get the city back to normal as quickly as possible. But then we also have done this effort called Climate Ready Boston,
right.
So evaluating what the city needs to do to be prepared for the storms that we can expect towards the end of the century as well.
So what steps have you guys taken based on that planning effort, Climate Ready Boston? I mean, have you changed, for example, where developers are able to build, or have you changed the requirements when it comes to how new structures need to be built?
Right.
Either of those?
The first phase, and this is an ongoing effort, so the first phase really focused on where are we most vulnerable and what recommendations do we need to implement moving forward. The second phase, which is ongoing right now, is looking at some of those most vulnerable areas, such as East Boston and Charlestown, and what can we do from an implementation standpoint. We're also moving forward with work in South Boston that is going to look at some of those initiatives. Do we need to make changes to our zoning code? Do we need to have some green infrastructure or gray infrastructure to protect Boston?
Deanna, Austin's talking about a lot of things that are being considered right now, questions that are being asked. Do you think that the city is moving quickly enough to address those?
I mean, I want to credit the city. They've done a lot of research and a lot of planning, and that's, you know, an essential first step. But I think where we've fallen a little bit short is implementation. If we've learned anything from this storm, it's that this is all very urgent and that something like this could happen to Boston any day. And I think what we've seen the most from this storm is the human cost. I mean, the death toll is still rising. We focus a lot on development, but there's so many other impacts. I mean, just today, ExxonMobil, you know, notified Texas regulators that one of its facilities was damaged by the rainfall and that there will be toxic pollutants admitted into the atmosphere beyond legal limits for a period of time. And unfortunately, we have that exact same scenario here in Boston, where ExxonMobil has a terminal in Everett on the waterfront that's not prepared for climate change. And, you know, if Hurricane Harvey were to hit Boston tomorrow, you know, the pollutants from that facility would be spread into the streets of a very vulnerable community.
I just want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear on this. When I asked about whether protocol has changed in terms of planning and construction, I've been fascinated for a long time with the fact that the locus of new development in the city in the past few years has been the seaport, which, as I understand it, is an extremely vulnerable area if an event like this takes place. Right now, do people who are putting up a new building in the seaport, do they need to take certain steps, like, for example, putting parking on the bottom 2 or 3 levels, or putting all their energy-generating infrastructure on the top floors, or is that optional?
So what developers need to do, particularly if it's a large development, is they have to submit something called a climate readiness checklist. So they submit to the Environment Department as well as to the Boston Planning and Development Agency what they're going to do to make sure that their building is ready for some of these climate impacts.
And is it up to them to take the lead there, as opposed to you guys telling them you need to do X, Y, and Z?
Well, they start the process, but then we give them feedback as they submit to us and tell us what they're hoping to do.
Deanna, what do you think of that framework?
In our experience, having it be more of a voluntary checklist the way that it is, I mean, the developers are required to fill it out and submit it to the city, but when it comes to negotiating what's done and what's not done, you know, we've seen a lot of developers move forward with projects that are not climate resilient or are not where they need to be, and the onus really falls on the developer to decide whether or not they want to be climate resilient, and in a lot of cases, you know, they haven't been.
I would like to ask about 5 more questions about this, but I need to ask really briefly, we're almost out of time. I know there's been talk of putting a massive new sea barrier around Boston Harbor. This would be extremely expensive, billions of dollars, huge engineering feat. It is happening in other places around the world, though. I think we have some video of, that's Rotterdam, I believe, where they put in a swinging structure, similar in some ways to what could be created in Boston. Also Hull, England, I think. We have a clip of a sort of a guillotine-like structure aimed at preventing flooding in a river there. Austin, what's the status of this plan? Is it still hypothetical, or are you guys planning to do this?
So UMass Boston is leading a feasibility study for a harbor-wide barrier. My team has actually been to Rotterdam to see the structure that you had on screen. And so there are many things that you have to consider when you're doing a structure like that. What is going to be the economic impact? We've spent billions of dollars to clean up our harbor, to make sure that we've improved access to the Conley terminal, to provide jobs and access for our economy. Also, when you put up a barrier like that, what's the ecological damage that you also sustain? How big of a gate would you need to put into a barrier like that to allow traffic to come back and forth? So there are many, many different things that we have to consider as we're looking at something like that.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I'm fascinated with that scenario. Austin Blackman, Deanna Moran, thank you both for being here.